and ultimately our traumas. And that's why when we think about, the context of young people, it's important that we just kind of bring in now just a couple of new theories that will enable us to kind of think again in that wider context of the factors which contribute to these particular behaviors. And again, one of the theories that I want to kind of talk about is something that is known as maternal deprivation. Some of you may be familiar with maternal deprivation by John Bowlby's work. So I'm not going to bore you too much, but I have to go through it in terms of just kind of a snapshot of what Bowlby was talking about. So he was ultimately a British psychoanalyst. So as you can see, an individual that was, studying the mind of individuals. And I guess his theory of maternal deprivation is one that's better known within my world of criminology as the theories of delinquency. So if you have any criminology books to hand, you've studied criminology or social science, you may have heard of the term theories of delinquency. And maternal deprivation is one of those particular theories that enables us to get a better understanding of criminal behavior and how that exists amongst children going into the transition of adulthood. So ultimately, his theory stated that children needed constant and continuous care from a primary caregiver from birth up until the age of 5. So very clear about the fact that there needs to be consistency in terms of the relationship between parents, and a child from the moment that they're born up until they're 5. And I guess his study and his research was predominantly with young delinquents. So again, young people that were involved in criminality. And his study suggested that if a significant separation of more than 6 months occurred during this lifespan, there was a risk of delinquency, and that was increased. So the longer a parent was away from their child for 6 months or more, made that child's risk and vulnerability higher as it relates to issues around delinquency. And of course, there's going to be many critiques about any theory, and I've said this to you on many sessions before, that it's important that we utilize these opportunities to challenge, to check the validity of these particular theories and test them within your own particular context. But in terms of what I would say criminology, social science 101, just as a basic foundation, it is important that we just look at some of these theories to just give us a little bit of a taste of some of the academic space that enable us to understand why we see children behave the way that they do. And I guess Bowlby's work developed over time. And as he started to develop his work around young people that were delinquents or young people that had been involved in criminality, his work with emotionally disturbed children and young people developed his later terminology known as attachment theory, and many people are more familiar with this. And attachment theory ultimately considered the importance of a child's relationship in terms of their social, emotional, and cognitive, their mind development. And I guess his theory ultimately suggested that if there are severe consequences to relationships later on in life, and if early bonding and attachment with the mother or caregiver was disrupted, later on in life, we'd start to see a range and series of behaviors. And I guess more recent studies started to indicate that parenting practices can be predictors of early childhood offending. So the way in which parents parent their children, or a caregiver parents their children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, neighbors, whatever that individual that's classified as a caregiver may be, those practices and the way in which that individual gives off love and empathy and so on and so forth, and the way in which that may change in the way that those behaviors that may exist may cause a factor that those particular young people may show signs of early offending. And again, this doesn't apply to every single human being, but again, just going back to Foundation 101 of social science, sociology, and criminology, just getting us all to think. But rather than me just talking and explaining it, I've just got a very nice video that we can utilize in order to explain attachment theory, maternal deprivation in 7 minutes. So here we go.
Theory argues that a strong emotional and physical bond to one primary caregiver in our first years of life is critical to our development. If our bonding is strong and we are securely attached, then we feel safe to explore the world. We know that there is always that safe base which we can return to any time. If our bond is weak, we feel insecurely attached. We are afraid to leave or explore a rather scary-looking world because we are not sure if we can return. People who are securely attached are said to have greater trust, can connect to others, and as a result are more successful in life. Insecurely attached people tend to mistrust others, lack social skills, and have problems forming relationships. There is one type of secure attachment, and there are three types of insecure attachments: anxious ambivalent, anxious avoidant, and anxious disorganized. In responses to distress, the first three react organized, while the last acts disorganized. To understand the theory better, let's look at Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who have 4 children: Luca, Anne, Joe, and Amy. The Smiths are lovely parents who cuddle, make frequent eye contact, speak warmly, and are always there for their kids. But one day, Mr. Smith falls very sick and dies. For Mrs. Smith, life now becomes very difficult. She spends all day working, while at the same time trying to care for her children. An impossible task. At 6 years of age, Luca's brain is for the most part developed, his character strong and his worldview shaped. The new situation does not affect him much. He knows there is still always Mum, his safe haven. He feels securely attached. Later, he turns into a trusting and optimistic young man. His self-image is positive. Anne, who is 3, has problems coping with the new lack of attention. To Anne, her mother now acts unpredictably. She is anxious about their relationship and as a result becomes clingy. To get her mum's attention, she has to raise her emotional state and scream. When her mum finally reacts with a predictable response, she herself acts ambivalent and doesn't show her true feelings. Later in life, others think Anne is unpredictable or moody. Her self-image is less positive. Her attachment style is anxious ambivalent. 2-year-old Joe spends his days with his uncle, who loves him, but thinks that a good education means being strict. If little Joe shows too much emotion or is too loud, his uncle gets angry and sometimes punitive. This scares Joe. He learns that to avoid fear, he has to avoid showing his feelings, also in other situations. As an adult, he continues this strategy and has problems entering relationships. His image of himself is rather negative. His attachment is anxious avoidant. Amy, who is just 1 year old, gets sent to a nursery. The staff there is poorly trained, overworked, and often very stressed. Some are outright abusive. Amy therefore becomes anxious of the very people she seeks security from, a conflict which totally disorganizes her ideas about love and safety. As she is experiencing fear without resolution, she tries to avoid all social situations. As an adult, she thinks of herself as unworthy of love. Her self-image is very negative. Her attachment is anxious, disorganized. Our attachment is formed in the very first years of our lives, a time when we are too young to communicate our anxiety, and as a result, can experience high levels of stress. Then our adrenal gland, an organ sitting on top of our kidneys, produces the stress hormones adrenaline and cortisol. The heart rate increases, the blood pressure goes up, and we become alert. If that happens frequently, it is called toxic stress. Toxic because it impairs the development of a child's brain and weakens the immune system. In embryos or at a very young age, toxic stress can even switch the expressions of genes, which can affect our health many decades later. By simulating a strange situation, we can assess an attachment style already by the age of 1. To do this, we let the child play with their mother for a few minutes inside a room. Then the child is left alone. The key moment is the child's reaction when her mother returns. Securely attached children first usually hug their mother, then can calm down and eventually get back to playing. Insecurely attached children can be ambivalent and avoidant. Some can't stop crying or refuse to continue playing. The long-term effects of our attachment in the early years are well documented. Using the theory, researchers at Minnesota University were able to predict already at age 3 if a child would drop out of high school with 77% accuracy. In another study, undergraduates at Harvard were asked to assess how close they felt to their parents. 35 years later, they were asked about their health. 91% of those who said they had a rather broken relationship with their mother were also diagnosed with health issues, including coronary artery disease, hypertension, and alcoholism. For those that had reported a warm relationship, the figure of poor health diagnosis was just 45%. But there is another reason why the early years deserve special attention. They are the starting place for subsequent behaviors. A kid that feels securely attached at age 2 can make friends at kindergarten. Their worldview gets reinforced with every interaction, and they develop optimism. As a result, they make good relationships at school, then at college, and later at work. Highly insecurely attached children can miss out on this opportunity. Psychologist John Bowlby, a pioneer in attachment theory, allegedly said, "What cannot be communicated to the mother cannot be communicated to the self." In other words, those who feel insecurely attached might not quite understand themselves. To get to know who they are and what they feel, they might have to go way back in time.
Okay, so I thought it was interesting that we kind of just got you to just look at and think about and consider the short video that spoke about the attachment theory and then building on from Bowlby's work and others about maternal deprivation. But one of the things that you may want to do now, just to kind of think about and pause, is how things like attachment theory, things like maternal deprivation may be linked to issues around gangs. Utilize this as an activity and a form of discussion. Pause the video if you need to and extend that conversation. Write some of your thoughts, write some of your ideas based on what was presented in the video, and do so. And again, if you want to recap the video, what I will also do as well is I'll make sure that I send the link to that video so you can review it again as part of your activity and ultimately use that to move forward. And I guess one of the things I think is important to just kind of highlight here is we're talking about, again, the wider context and getting you all to now think about, you know, some of the challenges where children and young people are faced. And I'd like to think that you're getting to this particular point now is that more and more we start to explore these things around alienation and marginalization and the lack of needs and the factors that are systemic and those social factors that exist within particular environments that create these particular opportunities for young people to do these things. We start to learn more and more that maybe it's not just about, you know, children and young people going out and about and behaving in a particular way, that is obviously much deeper. There's obviously something that is triggering and creating these particular situations for them to do the things that they do. And I guess this particular module, just to kind of reinforce the point, is just to enable you to kind of have that in-depth understanding. So you speak from a place of knowledge. And all that does is strengthen your experience, strengthen your understanding of those particular issues, and you're able to kind of talk about it from a different level. And I guess one of the things that I think is important that we speak about at this stage, when we're thinking about things like maternal deprivation, we're talking about attachment theory, we're talking about the way in which people behave. I think it's important that we talk about the notion of socialization and how children and young people are socialized within a particular context. And I think one of the things just to kind of throw out there, just as a definition, when we're talking about the notion of socialization, not to bore you because you may have heard the term before, but those that haven't, socialization is just generally a general term for the many different ways and processes by which children and young people come to be able to function as members of their social community. It is in part a process of learning and in part a process of being taught. But modern views of socialization also stress the active role of children in making sense of their social world and constructing their own ways of being part of their social group. So a lot of that is also about this idea of young people being self-independent, self-determined, that enables them to be able to make sense of their world. And again, going back to the way in which they view the world, remembering your marginalization and how individuals perceive the world becomes really important and enabling them to make sense of that. And again, if you think about socialization, just kind of like an add-on, I think one of the things is just an important just to kind of highlight is that socialization is also long, it's a drawn out process. And I guess in some aspects can continue throughout one's lifetime. So even us as adults, we're still being socialized. Why? Because things are forever changing. So when adults find themselves interacting with people from unfamiliar cultures, or even we join a new social group in our own culture, there may need to be an adjustment and new ways of behaving. So for those of us that now, as we're getting older now, we're joining new groups, I join the gym now and start hanging around with a particular fitness class. So the ways in which I behave has to be different compared to when I'm with my boys and we want to be loud and we want to be aggressive whilst we're engaging in a combat sport or whatever. So the more and more that I'm around different groups, for example, I'm learning of different ways. And then also being around different cultures also enable me to be different. So I know that coming from the Caribbean and my family are from Jamaica, we're loud, we're vibrant, we love our vibes. And that's the way that we ultimately engage. But being around other people and other cultures, it may not necessarily be that. So even as adults, we're constantly being socialized. So children and young people are growing through their transitioning from childhood to teens to adulthood, and they're forever going to be socializing and changing the way in which they think, the way that they behave. And then when we talk about some of the wider issues, or less the agencies of socialization, just so you just have as a quick note, again, family, we get socialized through our family and our experiences and the things in which our parents and our grandparents have taught us. I feel like as I'm getting older now, and some of you may agree with this, as you get older, you start to sound like your parents. And it's funny because I was telling my young son off doing something naughty. And I remember my mum saying to me, "You're now starting to sound like your dad." I just feel like the more and more I'm getting old, I'm really actually starting to sound like him, the way he loves cuss, the way he's always shouting. And I'm thinking, I don't really want to be like this man. But as I've noticed, as I'm getting older and older, I'm becoming more and more like him. So we know that we get socialized through our family. The community also socializes us as well, because whilst we come outside of the parameters of family, we have to connect with the community. And in our community, people are different. And especially here in the UK, not everybody's black and not everybody's from the Caribbean. You've got loads of different communities and communities within communities. So here we may say we've got the black community, but you've got Nigerians, you got people from Ghana, you got people from Senegal, you got people from Somalia, you got people from Eritrea, you got people from Uganda, you got people from Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, you got people from Guyana, you got people from all over the place. And the way in which they interact, and they all come with their different cultures, and the amalgamation of those particular cultures is what socializes the way that we are. And that's where things like slang and terminology and expressions ultimately may come from. And then things like education, we're socialized within education, how to think, how to talk, how to behave. And whilst we get that at home and within the community, we get that kind of refined opportunity within an educational institution. And especially if the institution is one that is governed by a religious institution, especially, or whether that may be private, where people are paying particular finances for a kind of high level of education. So the socialization process is most likely going to be different in those particular spaces. And then we've got our social groups. So despite family, despite community, we got our friends, we got our people that we vibe with every single day, and we do different things all the time. And again, if we're coming from different cultures, different belief systems, and we have different ideas about the world, then obviously, most definitely, we're going to be socialized into thinking a range of different ways. And then also the things that we read, the things that we visualize, the films, the news articles, the papers, the films in which we watch, the documentaries in which we engage in, and then all of the things that we may see around the world in terms of film and documentary. And then we've got religious institutions, spiritual institutions, or whether that may be, that also socializes us in the terms of the notion of moral compass. So yeah, you are going to get that from family and community and within education. But when we're thinking about things like religion and spiritual beliefs, we may follow a particular code, a moral compass that may be linked to things like, I don't know, prophets and messengers, that may be linked to things that may be in the context of the Bible, in the context of the Quran, for example, and the way in which we utilize those particular religious texts govern the way in which we think, the way we behave, or ultimately strive towards a particular ideal that will make us an individual that, one, sees our true purpose of being here on this earth, but also in a way in which we're going to engage with family, community, and giving back to society ultimately as a whole. And then the government also socializes us as well. We've got to think about the ways in which law, legislation is written, and through those laws and legislations govern the way that we think, the way that we behave. And again, you've heard me mention previously in the webinar the idea about politicization and the fact that politics can also govern the way that we behave. And you heard me mention also that politics also can be an influencing factor to why we may have violence within particular communities. So it's important to understand that even the government can socialize us. And I would even say, even currently now, within the pandemic, our governments are socializing us. You can't go nowhere now unless you have the mask on. Now they're talking about we need to all have a vaccine. So they're socializing us into thinking that if we don't do something, then there's a series of consequences. And again, socialization is something that is long-term, it's drawn out, and it's not a quick fix. And I think social media, I think, again, just reinforcing the point, we've got social media platforms now that socialize us and the way that we behave, the way that we think, the way that we look. It also enables us to have this idea about, like, and this new like culture. And what that means is the like button that's under every post that people upload. And the more likes that you get means that you're popular, means that you're loved, means that everybody's looking at you, versus individuals that don't get liked at all. And then that also causes a series of distress and anxiety and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand all of these different agencies of socialization. And again, I want you to think about some of those examples that I've used, but utilize them within your context. Just to kind of move forward, one of the things I think is important when we talk about socialization, I want to just bring you into contact with another piece of literature within social science, more specifically within sociology, that talks about attachment theory, but talks about attachment theory in a very interesting context and through the lens of trauma. So within sociology and a lot of literature within social science in particular, there is a particular term known as adverse childhood experiences. And one of the interesting things that this particular mind frame, this particular idea that's presented within the literature ultimately suggests and talks about trauma and says that traumatic experience can have a negative effect and a lasting effect on one's health and well-being. So the argument that is presented within the literature that if a child has 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, then the likelihood that there's going to be issues that may be presented later on in life. And all I've just done here quickly is just showed you a quick kind of example or a chart or a model that you can utilize just to kind of pick apart, to get you to kind of think about some of the ideas in which is being presented. And one of the statements that has been suggested is adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. I'll say that one more time. So adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. A very big statement, but the key word that comes out here is this idea around public health. So now you start to see now that educators, academics, practitioners alike are now shifting the focus on just looking at punitive measures to engage with issues around violence and getting us to think about those social factors, those root causes. And it's part of those social factors and those root causes that cause those traumatic experiences. So what we now need to be doing now is attaching all of those theories into some of the recent contemporary research that is suggesting that whilst we talk about the systemic issues, whilst we talk about attachment, maternal deprivation, whilst we talk about double consciousness, marginalization, social disorganization, strain theory, and all of the things that we've mentioned so far on this program, now we're starting to recognize and understand the conversation about trauma. So when you get then to your mental health unit or module, you then start to become more aware of the things in which I am presenting here today. So what is an adverse childhood experience? And again, if you just fixate on the bottom left of the screen, things like household changes, domestic violence, substance abuse, mental health, or engaging or having a parent or a sibling that has issues around mental health, parental separation, divorce, an incarcerated parent, abuse even, things like emotional abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And then you've got issues around neglect that may be emotional or maybe physical. So when you think about all of those things in context, and then you think about some of the points that was just made around attachment theory, I want us to now apply this in relation to gangs, because each and every one of us would have had an adverse childhood experience. All of us would have. So that's not to suggest that just because you've had an adverse childhood experience, that means that you're going to be a gang member, you're going to be a criminal, and so on and so forth. But what it's doing here is enabling us from a quantitative perspective, meaning to get the data and the numbers to get us to have a better understanding of what we're seeing here. So again, going back to my point, each and every one of us would have had an adverse childhood experiences. I've had a few. I had friends that when we were growing up that had died, that had got shot. I had grandparents that had got cancer and died. I seen my first dead body when I was about 8 years old of my auntie, when I first remember going to a funeral. I remember touching her body and I remember it being cold and it really bothered me. I remember growing up and I remember watching a video of a beheading. Now, I don't know how I got onto this particular website, but it must have been something I was messing about with at a friend's house. We may have entered onto the dark web, who knows? But I remember watching a video and it really bothered me as a child. Now, all of those things will be classified as adverse childhood experiences because children are not supposed to be witnessing and observing these things. However, in context to what's been presented here within the literature is that 4 or more, and then you can imagine young people that have coming out of households where there's violence, where they've seen people get shot, they've had siblings that are dead, they've got aunties and uncles being incarcerated, they live within an environment where shootings and stabbings happen every single day. That is traumatic. So then when you start to think about how young people are then socialized within a particular context, and you've got issues around trauma, how heavy this may weigh on an individual making that transition from childhood to adulthood. And what I want you to do it again is as an activity, is halt the video here and have that conversation about some of your traumatic experiences. You don't have to talk about all of them. I've only expressed a few of mine. But I want you to also think about individuals that you've worked with, children, male or female, that have had 4 or more ACEs, 10 ACEs, 15 ACEs, 20 ACEs, some even more, that may be linked to things like household abuse, neglect, and then things that happen outside of the household. And then when we start to think about then the adverse impact, going back to the statement, the single greatest unaddressed public health threat to face our nation today, we then start to think about things like lung disease. And this links to some of the video some of the aspects of the video that was just presented. 4 or more ACEs, 3 times more likely to get lung disease, 14 times more likely to want to commit suicide, 4 to 5 times more likely to want to develop things like depression, 11 times more likely to be a victim of drug and alcohol and substance misuse, 4 times more likely to engage in sexual intercourse under the age of 13 before they're an adult, 2 times more likely to have liver disease. And then when we start thinking about the young men and young women that we engage, we then start to think about how those adverse childhood experiences and the adverse impact it may have on their lives as they start to get older. It puts things into a greater context. But what I want us to also think about is something that we've already covered. And when we're thinking beyond gangs and violence, and when we're thinking beyond the groups in which we label to be involved in criminality, remember some of the things we've already presented. So when we're thinking about those adverse childhood experiences, let's go back to things like father absence and the adverse impact of absent fathers in the lives of young men and young women. The code of the streets, that whilst those traumatic experiences exist within the community, we're told that we can't talk. We're told we're not supposed to snitch. We're told we can't be informers. And then you've got the community that are disconnected, that are socially disorganized. So then everybody's just silent. So how do we move forward as a community? How do we respond to the violence when these key things that exist within our own communities present itself in such a way that embeds the trauma even more? So then when we talk about intergenerational conflict, intergenerational trauma, then you start to understand how things are passed down from one generation to another. And I think it's important that we have these conversations now to really start to unpack these social factors that contribute to the development of not just gangs, but the environments that are violent and continue to be violent. And I think one of the things I think is also important, I think one of the questions that you're probably asking at this particular point, and it links to the previous question in your other module or unit around how do we reduce marginalization. And I think the same question can be asked about parents, families, where do they fit within the issue of reduction? And I think a practical series of steps that we can embark on to get us to think about and consider is engaging with parents through workshops. Social media, you've heard me mention before, is an amazing way that you can engage with parents. And trying to engage with parents maybe through the arts, through documentary, through film. So there's so many ways that you can get a message out to parents and specifically young people, especially in COVID-19, while social media and people are utilizing Instagram Live, Facebook Live, TikTok even, and they're utilizing different means to communicate. And one of the things that I always say is that the more and more we wait and don't do it, those that are involved in criminality will continue to exploit the fact that nobody's talking and engaging to children, young people, their families, parents specifically. And there's one thing that my grandparents used to always say is prevention is better than cure. And again, when we think about the idea of curing something, we always kind of run to, and this is kind of the ongoing thing that I've been saying from the beginning that I have taught these modules, is that we can't just focus on solutions without truly understanding the problem. And what we're doing here is really breaking down what the problem is that will enable us to present that particular cure. So when we're talking about parents, these are the things that we need to be thinking about and considering. And first and foremost, one of them is making them aware of the issues that affect children and young people in your locality, in your context. So again, for me, with the work that we do with parents within the community and within this organization, what we do is we make sure that we do free webinars, free workshops, we do flyers, we put information that's out there, we do stuff on YouTube, put things out on Instagram. So parents are aware, even if they can't afford to be part of an initiative, and let's say an initiative may not be close to their household or so on and so forth, most people have access to social media. So there's things that we can put out on social media to get discussions going, to get parents talking, and also may connect them to individuals that may have free services. So for example, we know a lot of therapists within the community and counselors that are Black, that want to engage with Black children and young people and parents within the community. So it's important that we connect through social media to those individuals. We have to be proactive, or get them to be proactive in their kids' education, their development, social, mental, spiritual, religious, socialization, again, going back to that point again. So we have to get parents proactive. And one of the things I think is really important is that when children observe their parents showing that they're proactive and assertive in their education, in their social development, in their mental health, and so on and so forth, that has an amazing adverse impact in terms of a positive regard for those children and young people. And I think it's important that they must know their friends and know their friends' parents. It's important. So going back to this idea of village, you remember we spoke about village and this idea of when children don't feel part of that village, what do? They burn it down to feel its warmth. So if children are not a part of that village, we as parents need to step up the heat. We need to be proactive. So it's not just about inviting their friends to and from your household or getting them to be in the community. You ask them who their friends are and you want to make known who their parents are. So parents then have a better understanding of the type of individuals that they're around. Because you and I know if your child is hanging around with another child and they come from a household where their parents are involved in criminality and whatnot, your child may at some point go around there as they start to get older. And going back to what? Differential association. And the more and more they're around those particular individuals, you remember the theory that I explained to you before, you know ultimately what happens. But it's also important that parents start to research some of those local and national recreational activities that may be available for children and young people in their locality. Again, it's that idea about proactiveness, because one of the things that I found, even here within the UK and the young people that I work with, a lot of their parents just have this notion that there's no organizations, nobody's helping the youth. But there's organizations that are actually there, they're visible, but parents don't take the time. But I bet you if Carnival was coming out next week, I bet you if our party was going on next week, we would know and find out where those particular parties and raves and clubs are taking place. And in the same way that we have the energy for Carnival and party, is the same energy that we need to have in order to find those activities that are available for our children and young people. And for some particular families, and this is not something that all families are able to do, obviously because of finance, is some families may have to move, where children may have to go to another location. Parents, households may have to go to another location. And one of the things that we work here within the UK is that we work in conjunction with what we call safeguarding boards and local housing associations. So children that live in households where there's issues of conflict within a particular locality, and parents feel that it's unsafe for their children, we've happened to make them move. And that may not necessarily apply in terms of the institutions and processes that may be available to families within your particular locality. But I think the conversation about moving location, I think, is an important one when we're starting to think about and understand, you know, what are some of the issues and some of the challenges as it relates to young people that may be in danger and impacted by violence within the society. Choosing appropriate schools, I think, is also linked to that as well. Again, in your locality, there may be only 1 or 2 schools within a particular area. So I can't say for sure from your context, and this is something that you will have to discuss, you know, how is that in terms of parents enabling their children to go to particular schools that may be beneficial to them. And that's not always a financial issue, but maybe financial in terms of traveling expenses, in terms of work, and so on and so forth. So again, a lot of the things that I'm ultimately presenting here, again, is just a few things for us to kind of think about and talk about. It's not the be all and end all. And what I would like you to do is consider these things. And as always, as I say, change it, adapt it, or add on to. What are things that you can think about that supports an idea and a notion of prevention is better than cure? because that is really important when we're thinking about the context of reducing some of the issues that are ultimately out there. And going back to my previous point that I said about public health models, I haven't forgot, is that I said in a localized context, it may be about what we can do to kind of get that shift. So one of the things that we consider even here within the UK is that if you're within, let's say, a 15-mile radius, and let's say there's issues around violence amongst children and young people, then it would make sense that the nurseries, the childcare professionals, the local primary schools, the high schools, the religious institutions, the organizations that help the youth within the community, sit around the round table and have a conversation about, if a shooting goes off, and this is the point, if a shooting goes off in the local community, what is our collective response? So rather than every organization doing their own thing, it's a holistic response that enables us to engage with children as young as 5 years old up until the age of 18, 19, 20, and 21. So we're not only thinking about in a holistic sense, we're only engaging with young boys and young girls that are 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old. Collectively, we're thinking about how can we get them earlier? What initiatives collectively can we engage with them earlier? So one of the things that you may need to think about and consider is what type of individuals you want around your table. Individuals that don't hold egos, individuals that are not there for clout, individuals that are not there just because they want to vote, not because they want to show that they're some part of leader, a part of a community that doesn't acknowledge them to be a leader. What you need is individuals that have a portfolio of doing the work. And if you're from the community, that's not hard to find. It's only going to be a struggle if you don't have no links to the community, because as my parents would say, those in the community know who's real. And what I want to do is kind of end at that particular point